Story number 1. My name is Mark. I am 31 years old. This event happened to me a little over a year ago. Although I was 30 at the time, I was not popular with the girls at university. Girls sometimes looked at me, but only to copy my exam paper or homework. I didn't have any friends either. Most people I knew addressed me as, "Hey, you blondie." And I don't have a single buddy in my backyard. I socialize and make acquaintances exclusively with people I've met online. A few years ago, I met a girl named Elizabeth online who is a student from Europe. But this is not about that. This is about my neighbor, Aunt Ruth. I've known her all my life. My mom gets along great with her. Aunt Ruth is 55 years old. Her husband was killed in a fight at the club where he worked as a security guard 15 years ago, and she was left a widow in her 40s without ever finding a new partner. She is short and a little overweight, but very helpful, polite, and cheerful. I've always liked her. Even though she didn't have a model figure, she wasn't shy about wearing skirts that were just above the knee. I used to get nervous when we rode in the elevator with her. Such was the case on the day I want to tell you about. It was early July, a Friday. I was coming home from work. As I was opening the front door, I heard my neighbor, Aunt Ruth, say, "Mark, please wait a minute." She came toward me with a quick stride. She had 2 huge bags of groceries in her hands. She was wearing a tight gray dress, the bottom of which was slightly tucked up from her quick steps. Aunt Ruth led the way, and I eagerly followed her to the elevator. After walking a few steps forward, she decided to make a quick run for it. She set her luggage on the floor near the elevator and hurriedly adjusted her clothes, blushing with embarrassment. I helped Aunt Ruth carry the things into the elevator, as they were very heavy. She asked how my mother was feeling and invited us to her birthday party tomorrow. I thanked her for the offer and promised to be sure to come. I helped Aunt Ruth carry my things to the door and walked down the hall, rummaging through my bag for the keys to the apartment. By now, I had reached my limit of desire. Damn it, I'm 31 years old, and I've never been with a woman in my life. My roommate closed the door, and I walked over to her. I didn't know what I was doing as I pressed the call button. Aunt Ruth opened the door. "Mark, is something wrong?" she asked. "Yes, Aunt Ruth. I left my keys at home, and my mom went to the store. Can I wait for her at your place?" The neighbor agreed and offered me tea, which I declined. I sat down on a chair in the first room. The neighbor turned on the TV and went into the bedroom to change. I threw her a devouring look, which she obviously noticed. She went into the bedroom, changed, and came out looking at me, offering me something hot to drink, which I gladly agreed to. My aunt brought a bottle of red wine, and we settled on the couch to enjoy the dark red drink. The wine was excellent, and the discussion became lively again. We just sat and gossiped, and a warm fire flared up in our hearts. After drinking enough of the delicious beverage, Aunt Ruth opened up and stated that she could see me staring at her. At these words, I blushed uncontrollably and confessed my passion for her. Ruth replied, "I like you too," and moved over to kiss me on the lips. When I embraced her, my joy increased, and the fire that had been burning in me flared into a wildfire. I visited Aunt Ruth almost every day. She turned out to be a very kind woman who missed a man's warmth, and I was glad to help her with it, to give her all my warmth. I was on cloud 9 after finally losing my innocence with my middle-aged neighbor, Aunt Ruth. It was so nice to enter into a close friendship with a woman after years of loneliness and restrained longing. That summer, Aunt Ruth and I entered into a tumultuous love affair. By day, I anticipated our secret trysts with growing excitement. At night, I would slip over to Ruth's house, where she would greet me in beautiful clothes, a feast for my hungry eyes. Our age difference seemed to whet Ruth's appetite. She delighted in pleasuring my 31-year-old body, bringing me to heights of bliss I had never dreamed of. Afterward, we talked and laughed like old friends with a naughty secret of our own. As fall approached, I began to worry about the future. I had real feelings for Ruth. but maybe she was just enjoying an affair with a younger man. One evening as we lay in each other's arms, I awkwardly broached the subject of our relationship. To my relief and joy, Ruth gently stroked my face and told me that her love is real. She wants us to be together. I moved in with Ruth shortly thereafter and was happier than ever. We eventually got married in a small private ceremony, inviting only a couple close friends. Of course, tongues still chatter about our age difference as we held hands in our small town. But I don't care. I found my soulmate in Ruth, and nothing else matters to me. Our story proves that it's never too late to find love, no matter how unexpected it may be. Story number 2. Hi, I am a 30-year-old athletic guy who is happily married to a wonderful girl named Anna, who is 21 years old. However, let's turn our attention from young girls to my mother-in-law. It's pretty rare to have a favorite mother-in-law, especially when she's almost as young as my wife. I consider myself lucky to have such a beautiful mother-in-law who even surpasses my daughter in beauty. She may not be very tall, but she has a stunning figure with graceful curves. I must confess that thoughts of her visited me as I lay in bed. The furnishings in our house were quite interesting. I walked around in my underwear and my mother-in-law in her robe. In my mind, I always fantasized about talking to her about it, or at least hinting at it. One day, my wife went to a friend's house, leaving us alone in the apartment. It was a rare opportunity. I decided to relax a bit. I drank some beer, ate some potatoes and fish. For some reason, I bought a bottle of wine as well. When I got home, my mother-in-law had already gone to take a bath. She could splash around in it for hours. I retired to my room, turned on the TV, and opened a beer. I drank the first bottle quickly, as my throat was dry. As I was opening the second bottle, an idea hit me. While my mother-in-law was taking a bath, I decided to surprise her with a private party in the kitchen, being careful not to scare her. While she was in the bathroom, I carefully prepared everything, even finding a suitable romantic song. Then I called my mother-in-law through the door and invited her to join me in the kitchen for a chat. To my surprise, she walked past the kitchen and closed the door behind her. I waited, hoping she hadn't heard me. After a while, she finally entered the kitchen. My heart almost jumped out of my chest at the sight of her. With a surprised expression on her face and a smile on her face, my mother-in-law exclaimed, "What a delightful surprise!" I invited her to sit down, explaining that it was all for her. She accepted the invitation, although she looked pleasantly puzzled. As we drank numerous glasses of wine, I became increasingly brave and shared everything that was on my mind. My mother-in-law sat in a daze, but it wasn't long before she realized the situation. She was a wise woman. I poured her another glass and proposed a toast. "To us," exclaimed I. The wine seemed to have an effect on her. We both became more courageous. My mother-in-law smiled, gently placed her hand on my face, and that's when it all happened. A few weeks later, our secret trysts came to an end when my mother-in-law informed my wife and I that she was pregnant. To say I was surprised would be an understatement. I was in complete shock. And when my mother-in-law gave birth to her son, my wife was beyond thrilled to have a baby brother. I was happy too, not only because of the boy's arrival, but also because my wife still didn't know anything, and I hoped that would continue to be the case. As of the beginning of February 2024, my mother-in-law still has not told me who the father of the child is. She is silent and only smiles back. When he grows up, it will be seen who is the father of this beautiful boy who was named after me. Story number 3. After finishing my military service, I decided to get a higher education at a reputable university. While I was waiting for the start of the admission process, I attended preparatory courses and also found a job in one of the companies in a technical position. Interestingly, the company had a predominantly female staff. I interacted pleasantly with my coworkers and even flirted with a few girls. However, there was one woman who caught my eye, Aunt Margaret. She was about 12 years older than me, had a stunning physique and a beautiful face. Aunt Margaret was divorced and seemed to have a carefree personality, although I couldn't be sure of that. One day there was a holiday event at the town lake, and everyone decided to go to it. We had a great time, drinking beer in large quantities. I enjoyed the beer like it was my last chance in life to drink it. As the event came to an end, Aunt Margaret and I found ourselves in the same cab heading home. The beer had taken its toll, and I desperately wanted to go to the bathroom. As we pulled up to her house, I plucked up the courage to admit my predicament, asking if I could use her bathroom since I wouldn't make it home in time. Without hesitation, she agreed and welcomed me into her home. Well, with the beer being free and all, I may have gone a little overboard with it. We arrived quickly and entered her apartment. After getting out of the bathroom, I started looking for her in the two-bedroom apartment. I found her in the bedroom, sitting on the bed. I said goodbye to her, kissing her on the cheek. She took my hands in hers, looked into my eyes, and asked, "Are you leaving? Don't you like me at all?" I was a little surprised by this, but I assured her that I had liked her very much from the very first time I met her. And so began my relationship with Margaret. On Monday during lunch at work, Margaret came up to me and said, "As soon as you finish eating, come to that door over there. We have a warehouse where we store packing materials." I quickly finished my meal and headed for the door. Margaret joined me. We walked in and she opened one of the doors leading to a long hallway. The room was filled with stacks and rolls of cardboard and other materials. Margaret closed the door and mentioned that lunch break would be over soon, so we needed to hurry. I didn't need to explain twice. I understood right away. I enjoyed spending time with Margaret, both at her home and at work, where we often had privacy. As time went on, however, our meetings became less and less frequent. Eventually, things faded, the passion waned, and I decided to concentrate on my studies. Eventually, our relationship came to an end. Despite this, I still think of Margaret from time to time because the moments we shared were truly special and unforgettable. As my stay with Aunt Margaret drew to a close, I could not shake the memory of our tumultuous affair. The passion we shared, the secret meetings, among the boxes, at work, and the bittersweet end of our relationship sounded like a haunting melody in my mind. Back at university, I plunged headlong into my academic pursuits, determined to focus on my future and put the past behind me. However, no matter how hard I tried to bury the memories of Aunt Margaret, they surfaced like waves crashing against the shore, relentless and unrelenting. As the months passed, I became more and more absorbed in my studies, buried in books and lectures, trying to drown out the echoes of our time together. But deep down, some part of me craved the excitement, the thrill of the forbidden romance that had once consumed me. One day, as I sat in the university library over my textbooks, there was a familiar scent in the air that awakened something in me. I looked up, and there she was, Aunt Margaret, standing in front of me, a wistful smile playing on her lips. "Hi," she said softly, a tinge of nostalgia in her voice. "I've been thinking about you." Surprised and caught off guard, I struggled to find the words. Memories came flooding back, the laughter, the loving glances, the moments of intimacy we shared. Despite the passage of time, the bond between us had not faded. We sat down at a nearby table, and Aunt Margaret began to talk. She spoke of our shared love, of the passion that had ignited between us, and of the inevitable end that separated us. As she spoke, I felt a surge of conflicting emotions, longing, regret, and a glimmer of hope. Could it be that our story isn't over yet, that we still have a chance to rewrite the ending? In that moment, surrounded by the quiet whispers of the library, I made a decision. I reached out to Aunt Margaret, took her hand in mine, and whispered, "Maybe it's not too late for us. Maybe we can start over, write another chapter in our story." Aunt Margaret's eyes glistened with tears, and in this shared moment of weakness, we found comfort in each other's presence. The past may have been filled with mistakes and missteps, but the future promised redemption and second chances. And as we sat there, two souls entwined by fate and circumstance, I realized that our love story was far from over. It was a story of resilience, forgiveness, and the enduring power of love to transcend time and space. And with Aunt Margaret by my side, I was ready to begin a new chapter filled with hope, possibility, and an unwavering belief that love in all its forms will always find a way to triumph. Story number 4. My mother-in-law's water faucet broke, and instead of calling a professional plumber, she called me. But first, she complained to my wife about the mountain of dishes in the sink and that she was annoyed by it. I know a lot about plumbing. So many people call me for help when something goes wrong and breaks. My wife told me to go fix a faucet at her mother's house. It was my day off, and I just wanted to relax in front of the TV. "What do I get for this?" I joked. She replied, "You're not little. Try to guess." I chuckled. Despite my reluctance to go, I had to pack up and head to my mother-in-law's house on the other side of town. It was a long drive, about half an hour one way. I took my wife's words seriously, figuring that if anything went wrong, I could always say that she had given me permission for intimacy in bed when she sent me to my mother-in-law's. I'll play dumb. When I arrived, my mother-in-law was very grateful, realizing she had interrupted my day off. I calmed her down and asked her to tell me about the problem. She led me into the kitchen and sat me down at the table. As I got to work, I noticed that her robe was short and her beautiful knees were visible. As soon as I started fixing things, she asked if I had time to eat. I agreed, adding that I wouldn't mind some wine and a sandwich. My mother-in-law had recently celebrated an anniversary, and there were several bottles of wine on the windowsill. She readily went to the window, picked up a bottle, and poured it into glasses just as she did, treating me to some candy. We enjoyed the wine and talked a lot. In the midst of our conversation, I managed to quickly fix the faucet, which only took 3 minutes. I didn't want to leave, as we were having such a cozy time. My mother-in-law started complaining about her husband, saying that he has become so defiant lately and doesn't pay attention to her as a woman in bed. I offered to kick him out, but she only waved her hand dismissively. With a determined look in her eyes, she asked me how she could do without him. We continued to discuss the topic, emphasizing the importance of an active lifestyle for good health. I jokingly advised her to find a new lover and winked at her. My mother-in-law sighed again, mentioning how difficult it was to find a new lover at her age, as men tend to prefer younger partners, and those in their 50s are no longer looked at. I reassured my mother-in-law by paying her a few compliments on her looks, especially her beautiful legs. She looked pleased and blushed slightly. We drank more wine, and then we chatted. I jokingly pretended to be infatuated with older women and not interested in younger ones. My mother-in-law laughed and playfully scolded me. The wine had definitely had an effect. I stood up, kissed her, and we ended up lying on the couch. So much for fixing the faucet. After spending some more time at her place, I returned home. At home, my wife asked, "Why do you smell like alcohol?" She sniffed suspiciously at my clothes. "I just ran into a guy I know. I just stopped by for a few minutes." "Did you fix my mom's faucet?" she asked again. She's always so nosy. "Yeah, I fixed it," I replied, feeling annoyed. "Just leave me alone and let me rest." Exhausted, I collapsed on the couch and fell asleep, enjoying pleasant dreams and a feeling of warmth throughout my body. A few days later, while my wife was at work, I received a phone call. As expected, it was my mother-in-law on the line. "I don't understand something," she said with a laugh. "Someone promised to replace my lover, but they forgot the way to my house." I chuckled and jokingly replied that I hadn't forgotten anything. I was just busy with work. "As soon as you're done with work, come over. I bought some delicious wine, and I'll make your favorite sandwich," my mother-in-law said and hung up. I scratched my head puzzled, thinking, so my mother-in-law took everything literally, deciding that I really want to replace her husband. I found the situation tempting. It wouldn't be difficult. Besides, it had been a long time since I'd been with anyone but my wife. In my advanced years, I had become lazy. I quickly packed my things and went to my mother-in-law's house. She was very happy to see me and willingly helped me take off my shoes. She didn't know where to seat her dear guest. She finally sat down and immediately offered me a glass of wine. We relaxed, and the conversation became more interesting. We were back in that familiar situation. It was a delightful day, no doubt about it. My mother-in-law went for wine twice, truly getting into the holiday spirit. I loved spending time with her, as she always has interesting stories to tell. By the time I got home in the evening, I was exhausted but satisfied. However, my wife began to feel neglected, complaining that I was always going out to visit and she was alone at home. She didn't know what was really going on. It all started innocently enough. My mother-in-law had somehow gotten it into her head that I was filling the void in her bed left by her bad husband. She took my playful banter too seriously. That's the thing about women, they tend to get carried away with their fantasies. I decided to play along and please her until she lost interest. It was a win-win situation for me. The more I indulged her, the more I enjoyed it. Everyone knows that old saying. She even managed to pique my curiosity. I didn't forget about my wife, although she had to take a back seat for a while. After a month of constantly running errands for my mother-in-law, I started to feel overworked and got a little bored with the routine. I needed a break. But my mother-in-law had other plans, and she practically dragged me to her place, unwilling to take no for an answer. She even called my wife and asked her to send me over because the faucet in the bathroom was leaking. My wife handed me the phone with a submissive look. I couldn't refuse after all. Family comes first, and she was a lonely woman in need of help. I went in reluctantly, but the lemonade she offered me piqued my interest, and the cycle of our adventures repeated itself. I soon realized that my mother-in-law was quite devious. She always found a way to get what she wanted. If she had something in mind, she would stop at nothing to achieve it. I even remember an occasion when I was trying to find her a new partner. I asked my acquaintances if any of them would like to meet a mature woman. I spoke well of her, using all my charm. None of them were interested except one friend. He boldly asked for my mother-in-law's contact information and did not hesitate to call her. They met a few times, but nothing substantial came out of it. Surprisingly, my mother-in-law took a liking to me. It turned out that I knew how to fix kitchen faucets better than anyone else. She wasn't stupid either. She knew not to rush me. If I felt I was needed, I came, and if not, she patiently waited for the right opportunity. Our meetings became rare, but always pleasant. My mother-in-law sets the table, and the main centerpiece is the wine and her smile. I am happy with the way things are and don't want to change anything. As long as my mother-in-law respects me, everything will be fine, and I will be there to fix anything she breaks. That's how we've been living for 2 years now. Have you had a similar situation? Story number 5. This incident occurred during a New Year's Eve company party. Let me tell you about myself. I am Sandra, a 43-year-old married woman with an adult son. I am tall, attractive, and have short white hair. Men often show interest in me and try to get to know me. Our team consists of only 7 people. Among them was a 27-year-old coworker named Walter, who turned out to be a good-looking young man. There was a pleasant sympathy felt in our relationship. We both recognized that we mutually liked each other. We often flirted at work, but it didn't go any further than that because of our age difference and professional boundaries. The corporate party was held in our office, and I won't go into the details of the event itself. It followed the usual pattern: socializing, drinking, and relaxing. Toward the end of the party, Walter and I found ourselves growing closer. We secluded ourselves in the smoking room and playfully hugged each other. Then we kissed unexpectedly, and he suggested a drink at his place after the party. Under the influence of alcohol, I agreed, even though deep down I knew how it would end. On reflection, I have to admit that I even wished it would, because I had never cheated on my husband throughout our married life. But I found things in his pockets that gave me reason to think that he was cheating on me all the time. This gave me the idea of getting back at my spouse. We were at a corporate event, and throughout the evening, Walter and I exchanged glances. As the party came to an end, everyone began to leave. To avoid suspicion, Walter and I separately called for different cars, but coincidentally we ended up in the same place, his house. Luckily, he lived alone. I arrived first, and the cab dropped me off at his house. I was a little worried, but not 10 minutes later, a second car pulled up. Walter got out and gave me a hug. We walked to his apartment. It was a beautiful place, with a big bed that immediately caught my attention. We sat in the kitchen and had a few more glasses of wine. I was stunned by my own behavior. After all, I was married, and even though I had already crossed certain boundaries that evening, I thought it couldn't get any worse. However, the combination of alcohol and curiosity overwhelmed me. It was at this point that I realized I had to call my husband and let him know I would be spending the night at my friend's house. So, I had accomplished my mission and was free for the night. Walter was incredibly courteous, turned up the music, and asked me to slow dance. As we danced, I couldn't help but think about how bored I was with my husband, and in that moment I felt joy, even if it was just from dancing with Walter. As you can probably guess, what followed was a love affair that became my way of getting back at my spouse. The next morning, as I left Walter, I began to dream of our next encounter. And as fate would have it, it happened right at our workplace. He and I locked ourselves in a room full of drawers full of cosmetics. When he pushed me against the wall, a drawer fell and jars of face cream spilled out. We laughed, and among those jars, he did what he wanted. I was really looking forward to it. The revenge on my husband lasted for months. But that's a story for another time. Perhaps I'll share it later. Story number 6. My wife had a suspicion. She caught my eyes on my mother-in-law during a family celebration. She nudged me in the side. "Why are you looking at my mom?" she asked. "You're making it up," I replied, quickly shifting my gaze to someone else. My mother-in-law was quite popular, especially with the men. All eyes were fixed on her. She was dressed to impress, a tight dress that emphasized her deep cleavage. It looked like the dress was about to burst at the seams. Not many dresses could handle the large size of my mother-in-law's breasts. She was undoubtedly a stunning woman. In her younger years, there were rumors of her wild adventures and numerous suitors. My wife told me these stories, but I never believed them. However, my imagination began to run wild. We saw my mother-in-law infrequently, only during family holidays. The rest of the time, we relied on phone calls to stay in touch. She didn't interfere in our lives. But that evening, my mother-in-law was on fire. Her large gold earrings jiggled. She couldn't sit still for a minute. The other aunts were silent, including my wife. Compared to my aunt, she was a pale shadow. She was neither seen nor heard. She didn't utter a word. This is not my wife. I put down some salad and looked at my mother-in-law again. She seemed to sense that I was paying attention to her. She burst out laughing, which got even louder as she playfully jiggled her breasts. It was as if she had returned to her youth, radiating carefree and vibrant energy. Surprisingly, she looked no more than 45 years old, when in fact she was 60. As for me, I'm a little over 40, and I feel utterly exhausted by married life. The mere thought of a wife causes me indescribable frustration. It's been years since I've even touched her, and to tell you the truth, I have no desire to. I have no motivation to force myself into any kind of intimacy. Instead, my eyes wander to other women. I'm always on the lookout. I make attempts, successful or not, to form relationships with them. By the way, I am rarely wrong in my quest. When it comes to my wife, however, I find myself at a loss. She once seemed intriguing and alluring to me, with her cheerful disposition and voluptuous figure. But that was a long time ago. I haven't met any women like that lately. I mostly meet middle-aged women. If I meet a young woman, I wish myself victory and try to win her. Young women, as a rule, are less demanding and do not have a lot of life experience, so they are easier to deceive. I can't get rid of the feeling of curiosity and anxiety, wondering how my mother-in-law behaves in love affairs. What can she afford, and what can she not? Is she a good kisser? And in general, what does she look like in her natural state, so to speak? I stared at her, stared, and my wife shoved me in the side again. Have some decency. What are you staring at? Leave me alone, I replied, hoping she would stop bugging me. Isn't it any of your business who I stare at? I forgot to ask. You should just be quiet, like you usually do, and eat your salad. The guests began to dance vigorously. Even my mother-in-law joined in. Even though she was a large woman, she didn't seem amused by this. I even felt like putting my hand on her waist. I realized I felt a burning sensation in my pants from what I was seeing. I needed to come up with a plan. My thoughts were racing at breakneck speed. How could I get her outside? What excuse could I use? It was cold outside. I have vivid memories of my mother-in-law's love of automobiles. She knows more about them than anyone I know. This gave me a stray thought. After waiting about 5 minutes, I couldn't hold back any longer and blabbed. Mother-in-law, I said, I need your expertise. My car's engine is making a knocking noise. Would you mind taking a look at it? Maybe you can advise me on something. At that moment, my wife was not around. She had gone into the other room with a disgruntled expression on her face. As if it was my fault that she had a strained relationship with her mother-in-law, who looked shy and beautiful. After pondering for a while, the mother-in-law agreed. All right, let's go. It will be a chance to get some clean air. It's getting stuffy in here. None of the guests suspected anything amiss. Everyone knew my mother-in-law knew about cars, which is rare for a woman. She got up from the table, and I could hardly contain my impatience. I wanted to urge her to hurry up, but I held back through gritted teeth. We walked out into the yard and went to my car. I opened the door and invited my mother-in-law inside. She hesitated, not really wanting to do it, but by the glint in her eyes I realized that she understood perfectly well. Gesturing for her to sit in the passenger seat, my mother-in-law adjusted her dress and squeezed into the seat. I followed suit and started the engine, finding that there was no problem. The mother-in-law looked at me in surprise and exclaimed, "Everything is perfectly fine." I replied, "No, not everything." "What do you mean?" Mother-in-law asked, confused. "Well," I explained, "I mean that I appreciate you as a woman." "Oh dear, that's why I found an excuse to get you away from your guests. I wanted to be frank with you. A lot of people appreciate candor." My mother-in-law blushed, lowered her eyes, and adjusted the neckline of her dress. She glanced at me, but quickly averted her gaze. I gently stroked her knee, then the other. I reached for the neckline, but we might be seen, she whispered softly, letting me undo the top button. Confidently, I moved on to the second button. "Don't worry, no one will see us. The windows are tinted." She nodded and let me touch the most prominent part of her body. I let out a sharp exclamation. It was uncomfortable, but that's what was exciting. When you feel the excitement, even if there's no actual chase, the anticipation makes everything inside you tremble. My mother-in-law turned out to be a wise and experienced woman. She didn't make any unnecessary moves. Everything was clear and calculated. I saw in her a wealth of experience. So my wife was right. My mother-in-law had already encountered many men. There was no shyness or modesty in her. I admired that. I don't like it when women hesitate to act. They are embarrassed and say they can't do this and that. It was different with my mother-in-law. She knew exactly what to do. She let me do what I wanted to do and never once scolded me. I got out of the car first, stretched, and looked at the windows. No one was peeking at us from behind the closed curtains. Everyone was having a great time. My mother-in-law followed me out, swaying her hips gracefully. She had reignited the spark in me. We didn't give in to temptation, however, and didn't go back to the car. Instead, we headed for the house. To my surprise, my wife was waiting for us there. "Where did you disappear to?" She asked. "I searched the whole house looking for you. I even looked in the bathroom." I grinned to myself, thinking what a stupid mistake she had made. I quickly made an excuse, telling her that we were just listening to the car engine because it was making strange noises. My wife looked at me with an angry look. She had never understood anything about cars, and that was fine with me. "So you found the problem?" she asked. "Yes, we found it," I replied. I couldn't get it into my head that the real problem was her. At this point, my mother-in-law joined our conversation and suggested we look at the motor tomorrow. "I'm a little busy right now. Would you mind coming to my work tomorrow at lunchtime?" I was about to burst with happiness. Oh my God. She seems to have loosened up too, and she's enjoying it. That's great. It shows she's starting to get the hang of it. I could say the same thing about me. There's so much we haven't tried yet. "Thank you," I said, and went to mingle with the guests. I couldn't believe that I had put up with all this for so many years, doing the boring family routine. If I had known earlier that my mother-in-law was so good, I would have left my wife long ago and gone to her. I couldn't wait for tomorrow. I acted like a young guy who has his first date with a girl tomorrow. I felt young, and in a good mood, I drove home with my wife. Story number 7. My daughter and her children visit an out-of-town medical center once a month for necessary procedures. During these visits, I come to her home to help with various chores such as cleaning and cooking. This time, I visited her home again, but her husband David could not accompany them as he had to finish his report and go to work over the weekend. My daughter and the kids had already packed up and were rushing to the car. "Mammy, bye. We'll be there the day after tomorrow. Love and kisses," she exclaimed, sending me an air kiss. I took my time settling in, getting all the groceries into the kitchen and looking around the house. Eventually, I decided to start cleaning. The robot vacuum cleaner came in handy, though it got stuck on the carpet about 10 times, and about 20 times I had to untangle some threads. After I finished cleaning, I decided to take a break and drink a cup of flavored coffee and then start cooking. There was silence in the apartment as I laid out the groceries. At that moment, a feeling of dread came over me. I walked through the rooms, looking for any signs of activity. Everything was spotlessly clean, but no one was in sight. Glancing at the clock, I noticed that it was already 7 o'clock. With a sense of urgency, I exclaimed that David should be home from work any minute and realized that dinner hadn't been made yet. In a rush, I started cooking the first dish that came to mind to make it in time for his arrival. "I'll cook for tomorrow a little later. I have to feed David first," I muttered to myself, amused that I was talking to someone other than myself. A minute or two later, David walked into the kitchen, taking me by surprise. "Good evening." I greeted him, confirming that dinner for tonight was almost ready, but realizing that I still had to cook and prepare for next week. I pronounced, "Please sit down and enjoy your meal." "I'll be here for a while," I said with feeling, as I quickly set out plates of food for David. I pulled out a bottle of wine, poured a glass for David, and drank it myself. The wine was delicious, as was your company. I consider myself lucky to have you as my mother-in-law. You consider yourself lucky to have me? And you are lucky to have such a wonderful wife and children. You work all the time with no rest. Before you know it, the kids will be grown. I want more grandchildren. Why do you want more grandchildren? Even if you have nothing else to do, you can still have more children, he said. Oh, what a wonderful woman you are. Embarrassed, David stood up and started kissing me, expressing his love. "What are you doing?" I asked, pushing him away, but pretending I didn't like what was happening. However, I pulled him closer and continued kissing him, completely forgetting about cooking all night. Back at my place, I couldn't resist sending David a text message expressing my desire to repeat the previous night. 3 days later, David showed up at my house unannounced. At that moment, my friend, whose name was Eleanor, and I were sitting, chatting, drinking coffee, and smoking. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. I opened the door, and he immediately pressed me against the wall next to the door and kissed me. I was just shocked, and so was my friend. She was watching us because she heard the noise and decided to see what was going on. I slapped him so my friend wouldn't think bad of me. But Eleanor smiled and said, "David, will you kiss me? If not, I'll tell your wife what you're doing here." David scratched his cheek after the slap, walked over to Eleanor, put his arms around her, and kissed her. That's how the three of us spent the night, a lot of things I hadn't done that night in all my years of adult life. Thank you, son-in-law, for giving me a dream. Story number 8. This weekend, I made the decision to take a brief escape from my busy family life. I took my kids on a trip far away from the city to immerse ourselves in the Alaskan wilderness. We spent time fishing, hiking, and relaxing with songs around the campfire. My spouse and I often discussed the need to be apart, and I took the initiative to make it happen. Hopefully, she can get some much-needed rest during our absence. The trip to the river took about 9 hours, but here we are. Surrounded by a beautiful forest, various animals, chirping birds, and a seemingly endless river. I instructed the kids to unpack and gather firewood while I myself set up the tent, laid out sleeping bags, prepared fishing gear, and made sure we had plenty of fish bait. As I was laying out the fishing rods, evening crept up on us, and I realized that my kids, ages 7 and 8, were already playing by the fire. "When are we going to eat?" They asked. Hastily rummaging through my backpack, I pulled out sausage, cheese, bread, potatoes, and sandwiches. "Let's cook together," I suggested, handing the potatoes to my daughter. The evening passed quickly, almost without sleep. I fished, and the kids ran around telling spooky stories, trying to scare me. The next day was just as enjoyable. We boated, fished, and made soup. The original plan was to stay until morning, but an unexpected downpour forced us to quickly pack up and head home. The return trip was a long one. The road was almost impossible to see due to the bad weather conditions. "Why don't we stop by Grandma's house?" "She's 10 minutes away," I suggested to the kids. They agreed, and I turned to her house. All our clothes were damp. We were all freezing from the strong wind. The rain continued to pour down like a bucket. Upon entering the house of my mother-in-law, whose name was Barbara, she was terribly frightened as she was not expecting guests. "Grandma, hello. We've come to visit you," shouted the children, hugging her with wet hands. I told my mother-in-law the whole situation that had happened to us. She prepared dry clothes for us, fed us, and put the children to bed. I sat by the fireplace, unable to warm up. Drink quickly, she handed me a glass of whiskey and immediately poured it into my mouth, and I did not even have time to ask what it was. Glass after glass, Barbara tried to rub me to warm me up, but all to no avail, and I was shivering like a hare that had seen a wolf. Barbara pressed her body against mine to transfer the warmth. How sudden! My mind went fuzzy, and I distinctly felt that her hands were not in a comfortable place at all. "Something in the atmosphere got hot," I said, trying to stand up and move away from her. "It's not as hot as it could be yet," she said, pouncing on me, while the kids slept on the second floor after a nice nature walk. My mother-in-law gave me her warmth, lying by the fireplace. She was unstoppable. She was so hungry, like she was 20 years old. So we came to visit to warm up. What's gotten into her? I thought, what demon has possessed her? Probably, it is loneliness. A woman cannot be without a master in the house. My mother-in-law looks very young for her age. I don't understand why she won't find a second husband." The next day, we packed up and drove home. Barbara walked us to the car, kissed us, and smiled very slyly. She told me in my ear that she would be waiting for me to visit her again, preferably alone. Just like that, unexpectedly, my mother-in-law and I now have a sweet secret. As long as no one knows, we will have fun. Story number 9. Full of anticipation, John, dressed in a simple red t-shirt, blue jeans, and black sneakers, entered the office of his new boss. The brunette was sitting comfortably in the spacious, light-filled room, making quick notes in her professional journal. "Hello, Anna." He greeted her eagerly. "You wanted to see me?" "Hello, John," she replied in a soft, melodious voice, briefly meeting his gaze with her captivating dark eyes. "Please have a seat. I need to finish going over some reports, and then I'll get to you." Nodding silently, he sat down across from her in the same brown chair, unwittingly charmed by her presence. Despite her 48 years, Anna radiated a youth and beauty beyond many impeccably dressed businesswomen. Possessing a regal and mature beauty, she radiated unrivaled luxury, dressed in an elegant dark suit and short white skirt. The guy couldn't take his eyes off her, mesmerized by her appearance. Not expecting his new boss to have such an attraction, he blushed involuntarily and quickly averted his eyes, silently scolding himself. "She's older than you." "Stop it, John, stop it." "So, John, I summoned you," addressed Anna to him, having finished her business. At that very moment, however, she involuntarily noticed the way he was looking at her. Mentally, John felt as if he had fallen under the ground with embarrassment. "You are young. Springtime seems to be having its effect on you," she remarked. I slyly answer him with a look, she thought. I know very well that I unwittingly arouse the admiration of men. By the way, that's why I called you here. "I don't understand," he exclaimed, startled by her words. "What do you mean by that? Are you asking me to be loyal to you as your chief?" To gauge their loyalty to me, I conduct performance reviews when selecting employees for my company. First and foremost, the potential employee's willingness to obey me, their boss, in all things is assessed. John was stunned by the insolence shown by his experienced boss. Meanwhile, Anna got up from her desk, closed the office door, and sat down next to John. John was subsequently successfully evaluated in his new boss's office and eventually became her trusted assistant, spending much of his time there. On January 19, 2024, 2 new young men came in to apply for a job, and Anna, as director, called them into the office and ordered everyone in the office to take a break while she interviewed them. The whole office, of course, knew what was going to happen in her office. And these 2 guys named William and Harold didn't leave the office for over an hour, and I was listening to what was going on, but Anna probably knew that I would be at the office door. She opened the door abruptly, and she shouted, "John, what are you doing here?" She said with a smile, "Come on in and help the guys take the exam, because you passed it with flying colors." That's how my boss still hires young guys today. She has a principle. You take it or go home. Story number 10. My wife called me while I was at work. "On your way home, stop by my mom's house and set up the washing machine for her," she said with annoyance. I always try to avoid arguments with my wife to maintain a peaceful family life. Besides, I am quite handy and know a lot about machines. Besides, my mother-in-law is a single woman who has been divorced for 9 years. How will she get along without a man's help? I quietly grumbled to myself and went to her house. As usual, my mother-in-law greeted me without much enthusiasm, but at least she spared me the boring conversation. She had to be kind to me in some way, since I was taking time away from my own child. I walked into the kitchen, assessed the situation, rolled up my sleeves, and got to work. In just 30 minutes, I was done. As I was about to leave, my mother-in-law stopped me and told me that she needed to do the laundry, but she was afraid she'd do something wrong or press the wrong button. I nodded understandingly, and she brought me the dirty laundry to put in the washer. As I was about to cross the threshold, she stopped me again. "Let's wait for the washing machine to finish its cycle." "I don't want to ruin anything," my mother-in-law said. I agreed and sat on the couch, leafing through a magazine, waiting for the laundry to finish. My mother-in-law joined me, sitting with her arm carelessly behind her head, and we started chatting. She offered me tea, and I gladly accepted the offer. As we talked, the tension between us dissipated, and we found ourselves enjoying each other's company. My mother-in-law and I rarely spend time together, and unfortunately, we have never been able to find common ground. If we do manage to see each other, it's usually in passing or in crowded places. But this time we were alone. Just thinking about it made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't figure out why. On the other hand, she seemed confident and calm. "Do you want me to show you an Oriental dance?" she asked. I was taken aback and almost choked on my tea. "What dance?" I asked, genuinely surprised. "What? Didn't my daughter tell you that I take Oriental dance classes?" Her surprise seemed genuine, as if my wife and I had no other topics of conversation but her. I nodded and replied, Yeah, she mentioned something like that." My mother-in-law smiled and went into the next room, calling out from there, "I need to change into my clothes for the dance." I replied, Okay. And as I watched her, I couldn't help but think, "You're being silly. After all, you're already 58 years old, and even though you look trim, dancing is too much for you." But I decided to be patient and just observe. I turned on the music, and she came running into the room. And that's when my jaw dropped. For starters, she's out barefoot. She wore metal bracelets with bells around her ankles. I couldn't help but notice how shapely her legs were, almost like a young girl's. Her stomach was bare, not the firmest, but nothing to dwell on. Just a normal, slightly bulging belly. I've had worse, right? She was wearing a long skirt or a piece of cloth wrapped around her hips. Nice thighs, by the way. Instead of outerwear, she was wearing a bra, adorned with beads and rhinestones. I raised my arms and swayed to the beat of the music, twirling, bouncing. My eyes sparkled. I felt something. A small spark of excitement. After all, the woman in front of me was not lacking in sensuality. And I was a man. The switch clicked on by itself. My mother-in-law gestured for me to join her, urging me on with her hands. I gave in to the temptation. Leaning toward her, I held out my hand. She stepped closer and began to shake her belly in front of me. Surprisingly, it was very mesmerizing. I couldn't resist and kissed her navel. She jabbed her finger at me, warning me not to cross the line, but to appreciate the performance. I complied. She seemed to want to have a little fun with me. I'm not your average guy either. And that's not all. She screamed with happiness, and in one motion, like a magician, pulled her skirt off. I was at a loss for what to do. It was completely unexpected. You see, my mother-in-law has incredibly beautiful legs. At one time, she even participated in beauty contests and won awards. You can't have less long and shapely legs to participate in such contests. Even at the age of 58, her legs were as young as ever. I had never paid attention to her legs before, but now I couldn't help but notice. She quickly put on her high-heeled shoes and spun around again. My mind went blank. I hadn't expected her to be so carefree. I thought maybe her bra was about to come off, but it didn't. She danced around watching my reaction, and I began to feel humiliated. I was stunned by her behavior towards me all show, no touching. I got up from the couch and walked toward her, and she retreated to the back of the room. I took another step, and she stepped back again. That's how we ended up in her spacious bed. We even had a little wrestling match, but it was all a lot of fun. To my surprise, her shoes flew up and hit the ceiling, and the rest of her things hung from the chandelier. I used to think that only happened in movies, but it turns out that life can be just as unpredictable sometimes. Naturally, we were both confused. I clutched my head, thinking of my wife. My mother-in-law, however, remained calm. She leisurely brushed her hair, dressed comfortably in her home clothes, and folded her dance outfit neatly. Eventually, we remembered the washing machine. To our relief, there was nothing wrong with it, and it was working properly. We pulled out the laundry and checked the spin quality. "Well, thank you, son-in-law," my mother-in-law said, pointing her finger toward the door. Once again, I felt a little resentful. It would have been nice if she had said goodbye to me more affectionately, perhaps with a kiss or a hug. Instead, she became aloof and stern, like a snow queen. As I walked home, I couldn't help but ponder the behavior of women at this age. Why do they pursue men? What's going on with them? And why do they only choose young men? Are they trying to revive their desires, or are they taking revenge on their daughters? Why do they have so much untapped passion? Their shyness disappears, and their life principles seem to disappear. I decided to visit her the next day and prove who would have the last word. A little nervous, I nevertheless pressed the doorbell. My mother-in-law went wide-eyed when she opened the door. "You?" she exclaimed, taking a step back. "Are you the one who arranged for the renovation?" I asked in a firm tone, entering the hallway. In an instant, I grabbed her, picked her up, and carried her back to her original spot. She resisted briefly, quickly giving up and joining in the fun. This time it was exciting. Toward the end, I was even exhausted and panting like a wild animal. Honestly, her legs were driving me crazy. I had never seen such amazingly long legs before. I couldn't take my eyes off them. My wife's legs are fine, but my mother-in-law's legs are gorgeous. I got up, dressed confidently, and headed home. She tried to stop me, but I ignored her pleas. I am a firm believer that when someone says no, they mean no. As a man, I believe I have the right to make my own decisions. I didn't even bother to say goodbye. A few days later, I received a message on my phone with a heart emoji. It read, "The washing machine is broken. Can you help me fix it?" I couldn't help but chuckle to myself. She always wants more. However, I couldn't help but miss her long legs, and I won't deny that. I quickly packed up and grabbed my tools, trying not to make eye contact with her. I arrived at my mother-in-law's house, and to my surprise, she was ready to dance. She stood, fully prepared, waiting for an appreciative audience. Once again, she was wearing only a bra, a one-button skirt, and bare feet. I couldn't help myself and fell on the bed. She danced with such intensity and passion that it was mesmerizing. Honestly, I couldn't take my eyes off her feet. There was a lot to admire. Surprisingly, the broken washing machine was not even discussed. 2 days later, the mother-in-law called her daughter again to make me come over and show me how to use the washing machine again. What a mother-in-law, I thought once again. What happens to her when she is about to satisfy her hunger? I made a very unhappy face because I have to go almost every day to her mother, who can't handle simple things. And my mind was already spinning with thoughts of my mother-in-law performing belly dance for me once again. I collected the tool again so that my wife did not suspect anything, and went to my mother-in-law, enjoy her legs, and not only. Yes, women at that age are very sexy. They want to have a lot of fun. Story number 14. She was 37 years old, and she held the position of cosmetic sales manager in our company. She was tall, with an attractive cleavage and a stunning figure. All I desired was to spend some alone time with her. I, for my part, was 21 years old, and she was a beautiful blonde with long hair cascading down to her waist and captivating green eyes. During a company party at the company, I was awed by the sight of her deep-cut dress. It was truly exquisite. Her dark green knee-length dress made me lose my composure. Throughout the party, I watched her closely as she gracefully moved from table to table, flashing a smile. After a few dances together, she bowed out and stepped aside. While I was discreetly searching for her in the many empty offices in our building, we met by chance around the corner. She grinned, and I smiled back. She leisurely circled around me, but I was determined not to miss her. Taking her hand, I gently nudged her forward. Everything was going according to plan. She whispered softly, her eyes devouring me, seeming to swallow me whole. I pushed open the door to the dimly lit office behind us, where only a wide desk and a plush couch in the corner were visible. I closed the door, glad that Melissa had a spare key, though the whole key situation looked rather suspicious. We continued on our way without breaking eye contact. Stopping at the table, she knelt down and then kissed me slowly and greedily, never stopping smiling. I was puzzled. Was this really real? "Why are you so stunned?" she whispered, bringing me to my senses. The emotion was indescribable, but undoubtedly pleasurable. After this tumultuous encounter, she kissed me gently on the lips and winked, saying, "Don't get me wrong, I just like you." With those parting words, she headed for the exit, adding, "Next time I'll surprise you in a way you'll never forget." As she left, my mind was racing in anticipation, wondering what unforgettable surprise she had in store for me. I was looking forward to her call, but after our meeting she didn't show up for work. Her friend said she took a few days of vacation. All day long, I remembered her sitting on the floor with a smile and pleasuring me. Finally, Melissa called me at 6 o'clock in the evening and suggested we go to a restaurant. My dream had come true. Tonight, it would happen again. I love you, Melissa. Story number 13. The garage resembled a warehouse and served as a place to store all the things they couldn't part with. The unexpected news that the garage area would be used to build a new home had them looking for a new place for everything. William, being a jack of all trades, had many tools and equipment he needed for the job. Now there was an urgent need to figure out where to move all this stuff. However, it was his mother-in-law who was the most upset. She had a habit of collecting various small things, hoping that someday they would be useful. Under the circumstances, she could keep only a part of her peculiar collection because the living space could not accommodate the mountains of junk. She had to quickly prioritize the most valuable items. William arranged for a friend who lived nearby to temporarily store the tools with him. That same day, an absurd amount of money arrived in the man's bank account from the city as compensation for the purchased land. The developer assured him that the garages would be demolished in just 2 days. They had to get everything out in time, so he got in his car, picked up his mother-in-law, and together they went to remove their belongings. His wife had been informed of the impending demolition, so she was secretly glad that she wouldn't have to be a part of it. She didn't even offer her help, preferring to spend the day off in more comfortable surroundings. When the son-in-law and mother-in-law entered the familiar garages, they were greeted by an eerie silence. Most of them were already open and empty. Only a few people were still parking their cars there, and the rest of the neighbors had long ago removed everything of value. After struggling with the lock, William was relieved that he wouldn't have to fumble with it for long, since the garage would soon be gone. With a sense of satisfaction, he snapped the key in half. "So, Patricia, shall we get started?" "Huh," the mother-in-law replied sadly. "Let's do this first. I'll move my things out. I'll take them to a friend's house for safekeeping, and in the meantime, you put away what we'll bring back to you later." "Of course." "Good," replied the mother-in-law. The garage was bustling with activity. There hadn't been this much activity in a long time. On a slightly chilly fall day, the man and woman had even taken off their jackets, leaving them in sweaters. As William worked, he became more and more glad that he would never have to deal with this junk again, as most of it didn't interest him. He was able to take everything he needed from there, so he had little to lose from this forced move. His mother-in-law, however, was becoming increasingly melancholy. She had many items that had some historical significance to her and held memories. Going through old and unwanted items, she would stop from time to time, thinking about the origin and history of each one. Some of the items were gifts, and others had been purchased by her in the past. William watched her actions with disapproval, but chose to remain silent and not judge his mother-in-law. In a way, he understood the nature of her emotional attachment to these things. The man had traveled to his friend's house 3 times to move his belongings there. In the meantime, the woman had only managed to sort through half of her junk. In addition to the slow process of organizing the smaller items, she needed the man's strength to handle the heavier items. William helped to the best of his ability, but gradually impatience took over. Like her, he too was running low on energy and would rather relax in front of the television eating pizza than continue moving bulky furniture in a room that was soon to be completely empty. "Patricia, let's wrap up our efforts for today. There's nothing to see anymore. There's nothing of value in there anymore, I'm sure. Just a few old chairs behind the closet and a dresser." There was definitely something in the dresser. "It's dark in here, so don't strain your eyes." "Well, then shine a flashlight on me if you couldn't get light in here all these years." "I don't need it now," he said, embarrassed. "You handled the situation well." The woman took a defensive stance. William decided not to provoke a conflict with his mother-in-law and remained silent, simply turning on the flashlight on his phone. He was very embarrassed that he, a skilled craftsman who makes a living fixing, building, and repairing things for others, couldn't even install a single light bulb in his own garage. Bored, the man noticed the silhouette of his mother-in-law, hunched over, digging in the dust on the floor. She possessed an attractive physique. If she were younger, and she wasn't my mother-in-law, and I wasn't married, I'd invite her out for an evening stroll. Wah, woo, woo, woo. There's a lot of innuendo here. William shook his head, warding off the strange thoughts. For about an hour, the unusual couple explored the area illuminated by a bright lantern. From afar, they looked like looters who had decided to rummage through abandoned tools. The temperature had already dropped noticeably, and both family members' shirts were wet with sweat under their sweaters. The man twice offered to either finish the job or finish it the next morning, but his mother-in-law insisted on waiting a little longer. Eventually, at some point, William's cell phone flashlight ran out of power. Just what I needed, a dead cell phone, he thought. Now we'll definitely be done tomorrow. Okay, that's enough. Let's get changed and leave this place for good. There was such sadness in the woman's voice that her son-in-law felt sorry for her. "Patricia, don't be so upset. It's all in the past, and we have so many wonderful things ahead of us." William tried to cheer her up. "Thank you. Just close one side of the garage door, and I'll change," my mother-in-law asked. William closed one half of the garage door completely and headed for the car. "Oh no, I forgot my jacket. Would you mind grabbing it for me?" "It's lying on the passenger seat," she asked. William, who had already removed his wet t-shirt from his sweater, thought, what an unfortunate turn of events. Picking up his jacket, he reluctantly returned to the garage, which he already disliked very much. To his surprise, the iron door seemed to be resentful of him. Stepping inside, he stumbled and fell heavily to the cold floor. From the impact, the door pitched forward and slammed shut with a loud bang. William shouted a few curses, clutching his injured finger. When the sharp pain subsided, he stood up and looked for a way to open the door. It would not budge, however. He pushed it open with all his might, but his bare shoulder instantly froze to the icy iron. Their frustration echoed loudly in the confined space of the garage. The mother-in-law and son-in-law were left in complete darkness and uncertainty. It seemed impossible for them to get out on their own. William remembered the broken key in the door lock, and they immediately calculated how long it would take for their daughter to notice their absence. Unfortunately, their prospects looked bleak. Knowing the girl, she could easily have fallen asleep without waiting for her husband, Or perhaps she thought he had spent the night at a friend's house, where he had left his things. All the neighbors had already vacated their garages, and the builders were not due to demolish them until 2 days later. The family's situation was dire. Of course, they wouldn't starve to death, but William was already shivering from the cold. The temperature outside was about 7 degrees. It was foolish to expect the chilly garage to warm up quickly. The mother-in-law, of course, was taken aback by such an unexpected confinement, but after listening to her son-in-law curse twice, she decided to keep silent. Complaints would solve nothing, and William clearly needed support. "Put on my jacket," she suggested, realizing he was barely dressed. "Come on, it's a little small. You put it on, and I'll try to endure the cold." "No way. Let me keep you warm." Their voices sounded quiet but distinct in the cramped space. William reached out at the sound of the woman's voice, but it landed awkwardly on her lush breasts. The man was immediately embarrassed and jerked his hand away, but he remained silent and did not apologize. When the mother-in-law put her arm around his shoulders, the son-in-law hugged her waist in response, feeling not only the warmth and softness of her body, but also catching the notes of her fine perfume. This had a very peculiar effect on the man. The woman herself was still in some shock from what was happening, so the behavior of her son-in-law seemed to her just another strange act in a series of unusual incidents. She too remained silent, allowing her son-in-law to examine her body. "Put your hands under your t-shirt. Get as warm as you can," she whispered, not hinting at anything more. "What are you doing?" For the first time ever, she was indignant. "Just trying to keep warm as best I can," he repeated his mother-in-law's words. She was silent again and didn't utter a word until the morning. She was stunned by this unexpected turn of events. She did not resist, but simply accepted it. However, her son-in-law continued to warm his hands under his t-shirt. Like this, the night flew by in an instant. In the morning, hearing screams in the garage, they were saved by one of the neighbors who came to say goodbye to his storage container. He expected to see anyone but himself in the garage, and even his own mother-in-law. How had he spent the whole night with her? "I'd die if they locked me in with mine. But these are nice young men, ruddy, flushed, smiling," thought the neighbor. After this incident, the son-in-law often came to visit his mother-in-law when she was alone. He wanted to continue the story that happened on a cold day in the fall. As a man, he couldn't stand it any longer and wanted to be alone with her in the bedroom. Story number 12. The cooks decided to have a drink after finishing their work. Whether it was because of the holiday mood or because they just wanted a drink, they quickly set the table, sat down, and started chatting. There were 5 women, and I was the 6th, the only male in the group. I refrained from drinking, however, since I had agreed to be the designated driver for the evening. Instead, I opted for a glass of juice. The women were all mature, well over 45 years old. The tipsy male conversation eventually shifted to work, or women, while the female conversation always revolved around younger men. I felt comfortable in this company, for I had long since been accepted as one of my own. The center of attention was Emily, a petite woman in her 50s with blue eyes and a thick build. As the evening drew to a close, I packed everyone into the car and drove them home, dropping Emily off last. Emily lived the farthest away. All the way home, I listened to her talk about how she wanted to meet a young guy and have a vacation with him. Of all the cooks, Emily was the only one who lived with a man, but he was away for 6 months on a job. Emily expressed her resentment at the societal perception that only young girls are attracted to young men, and older women are neglected. I chuckled and said that I was not currently married, but finding the time and energy for a relationship every day seemed to be quite a challenge. When we reached the entrance, I dropped everyone off, one by one, until it was just Emily and me. She lived in a house on the outskirts of town, quite far away. As we drove up to her doorstep, Emily asked me to help her inspect the sauna stove, which was completely burned out. She said that if I could help her, she would be grateful and pay me whatever I wanted. We proceeded to inspect the furnace, but unfortunately, it was beyond repair and needed to be replaced. Emily was disappointed, but I assured her that she would only have to pay for the cost of the iron, and I would do the installation for free. After inspecting her sauna, I inquired about the availability of wide and low shelves. Emily told me that when her husband was alive, they often used to steam in the sauna, and the shelf provided a more comfortable environment. Although I had my doubts about her explanation, I decided to leave it at that, realizing that everyone has their secrets. I didn't regret the time spent helping her. Before I left, I informed Emily that I would be bringing a new furnace on my next visit in 2 days and asked her to prepare a small gift as a token of appreciation for her work. I also offered to test the sauna immediately after installation. Emily gladly agreed to my offer. Since the sauna heater was ready, I went to visit Emily. She greeted me cordially, elegantly dressed like a refined lady. Her youthful appearance was captivating. The furnace had been successfully installed, and the sauna was already heating up. We enjoyed our dinner and then took a rejuvenating session in the sauna. It was at this time that I learned why Emily and her husband needed a wide and low shelf. I visited Emily on numerous occasions, offering my help with various issues. Our bond grew stronger and resembled that of a committed couple. Interacting with her brought me great joy beyond the pleasure I'd experienced with younger women. Story number 11. I have a great relationship with my son-in-law. When my late husband Mason was still alive, he taught him how to do various chores around the house, such as cutting grass and chopping wood. Even when Mason was very sick and couldn't do much, Michael, my son-in-law, would come and lend a hand. Now that I am 51 years old, I don't feel old at all. Because of my husband's illness, I had to go without a partner in bed for a long time, so now I am rediscovering myself. My daughter is now 31, and it's amazing to see how she has grown. Thankfully, she has found a great husband who is always there for her. They live in the city, but recently came to visit me. My daughter had to go back to work in a few days, but Michael offered to stay with me for another week and help me with anything I needed. I gladly accepted his offer, as it would make my days less lonely, and I could use the extra help. I couldn't help but smile and wink at him, expressing my sympathy. I truly adore my son-in-law. We used to swim in the pool together, and I remember him looking at me with admiration. Now when I see him, I can't help but think about how handsome he is. And when Anna mentioned that Michael could stay with me, I was relieved and started imagining all the things we could do together. It had been so long since I'd been with a man and longed for love that I could imagine anything. And here was this handsome young man spending an entire week with me. It was like a dream come true. All that was left was to plan it perfectly. The first night we were under the same roof, I couldn't sleep a wink. The next morning I woke up feeling tired and empty. "Why don't we go to the river?" I suggested to Michael. "Sure, mother-in-law," he replied. We had spent most of the day out of the house, and as we sat on the riverbank, I noticed Michael furtively glancing at me. There was a glint in his eyes, and I sensed that he wanted more. I realized that our trip to the river had been worth it, and I decided to take action. That night, I prepared a bottle of wine and made some sandwiches. My son-in-law asked if there was anything he could do to help. I simply asked him to sit down and wait for a while. Everything was ready, and sitting down at the table, I said, "Poor son-in-law, let's get to know each other better, because frankly, it feels like we're not even related." Michael gladly offered to help me, and let me tell you, we had such a great time together that even the night seemed too short. The next day started the same as all the others, as if nothing had happened. And in the evening, my brother-in-law himself suggested, "Shall we continue yesterday's fun?" "Sure," I replied, and we went to the lawn under the tree to relax. Before that, my son-in-law and I had agreed that whenever he had free time, he would come over and help me because it can be quite boring and difficult without help. I will look forward to seeing him, ready to make delicious sandwiches and open a bottle of homemade wine and maybe even take another boat ride on the river. I am truly blessed to have such a wonderful relationship with my son-in-law, and I hope you all can experience the same with your own son-in-law.